Berlin from the air, the city strip, a flight from the west to the east. Only 20 kilometers long, and yet a flight through different times and different worlds. A flight to the large, bustling, irrepressible, crazy city of Berlin. The division of the city had severed a living organism. The words over here and over there are gradually disappearing. Wounds are healing. The scars, however, will remain visible for a long time. Pictures of the changing face of the city. Getting acquainted with a big city, it isn't that easy. But then very little is easy in this city that has two of everything. 2 state operas, 2 zoos, 2 telephone networks. It even began as a double city, Berlin and Köln, settlements on the banks of the River Spree. Köln was mentioned first in the year 1237. In 1987, the 750th anniversary of the city was celebrated. Twice, of course, in West Berlin and in East Berlin. Nowadays, it seems almost incredible that the abnormity of the division shaped life in Berlin for 3 decades. Incredible that every second Berliner has only known the city in its divided form. Finally, we are able to experience the city as undivided once again. The traces of the wall. Everyday life becomes history here and now, right before our eyes. The Nikolai District, the oldest part of Berlin. Using historical documents, it was reconstructed in the 1980s. The Ephraim Palace was also reconstructed. It had once been the residence of Frederick the Great's Master of the Mint, the most beautiful spot in Berlin. Feitel Ephraim was a Jew. Just a few steps away, the house of another Jew, Moses Mendelssohn, a scholar, writer, and philanthropist. Ephraim devalued money. The other contributed to the philosophy of enlightenment. Tolerant Prussia provided a home for the Jews. The Dragon Slayer once stood in the courtyard of Berlin City Palace. Different parts taken from the old city have been gathered here and form a kind of outdoor museum of the history of the city. The walls were burnt-out shells. The towers were stripped of the cupolas. That's how the Nikolai Church looked after the war. Situated in a flat and houseless plain, visible from miles away. It has re-emerged and is now a museum of the early history of the city. St. Nikolai represents the founding period in Berlin's history. The Red Town Hall is a better symbol of the capital. In 1870, the highest authorities of the Prussian capital moved here. And a year later, it became the town hall of the capital of Imperial Germany. In 1945, there were just empty walls left here, red bricks scorched by smoke. There is a saying that town halls embody the history of a city. Here, the saying was taken literally. The story goes that royal displeasure had been incurred because the tower of the town hall was higher than that of the castle. The frightened citizens hastened to appease the emperor by giving him a present, a fountain created by the sculptor Reinhold Begas, the Neptune Fountain. It no longer stands at the castle, removed by the workers' and peasants' state, and moved to the foot of the St. Marian Church. St. Marien is the second of the medieval city churches in Berlin, not as happily integrated into historical surroundings as St. Nikolai. The severity of early brick Gothic architecture and the diversity of shapes from later reconstructions contrast sharply with the unrelieved uniformity of the prefabricated slab buildings and the TV tower which dwarfs everything else. Berlin Center, the Alexanderplatz. None of the hustle and bustle of the 1920s and 30s is left. Berlin, Alexanderplatz. Once you could feel the heartbeat of the city here. This was the backdrop to the first movies, the scene of city novels, a three-tiered underground network. On top, hectic automobile traffic, trams, and railway trains. In the divided city, it was pushed to the edge. It wasn't until the tumultuous fall of 1989 that it reemerged, once again in the focus of world attention. That was when the Berliners stood up against a system of tyranny, violence, and suppression.
Einer schrieb mir, und der Mann hat recht, wir haben in diesen letzten Wochen unsere Sprachlosigkeit überwunden und sind jetzt dabei, den aufrechten Gang zu erlernen.
A socialist avenue, the Karl Marx Allee. It used to be called Stalinallee, a street haunted by its history. The rumblings of discontent at the Alexanderplatz were becoming louder every day, but the old guard still had itself celebrated here, as it had in all the years before. An imitation of the wedding cake style of Stalinist Moscow, a cause for ridicule or amazement. But at the time when these buildings were constructed, many people were very proud of them. There are still pictures that show what this street looked like in 1945. It was here, in the last days of the war, that Red Army soldiers fought their way from ruin to ruin against Hitler's last bastion. It is the same Stalinallee whose construction workers had already caused the communist regime acute embarrassment in 1953. A street that can't get rid of its past. Some people drive along this avenue on their way eastwards to visit the memorial for the 20,000 Soviet soldiers who lost their lives in the battle for Berlin. Berlin Treptow. The balance sheet of half a century gives this memorial special historical dimensions. Berlin is embedded in history. The world of classical antiquity, Asia Minor, the legendary scenery of the Aegean, in the middle of Berlin. The altar of Pergamon. It was one of the wonders of the ancient world. More than 2,000 years ago, Eumenes of Pergamon dedicated it to commemorate his victory over the rapacious Galots, the battle of the gods against the giants. A house built to exhibit works of architecture. The Pergamon Museum is considered to be the world's first museum of architecture. Strolling through streets, passing under gates as countless others did thousands of years ago. People whose faces and lives have long since been forgotten. This magnificent market gate was created in Malay 300 years after the Pergamon altar at the time of the Roman Empire. In Berlin, it was pieced together from ruins, saved by German archaeologists, just like the Pergamon altar or the Ishtar Gate of Babylon from the 1st century BC. At the end of the 19th century, German classical studies had achieved world renown, and the Prussian rulers proved to be understanding and generous sponsors. The Pergamon building is the youngest of 5 large houses that have made Berlin famous as a city of museums. Apart from the Pergamon Museum, there are the Bode Museum, the Neue Museum, or New Museum, and the National Gallery, opened in 1865 as a collection of works of contemporary art. The Alte Museum, or Old Museum, is the creation of the great architect Carl Friedrich Schinkel. Now the island in the heart of Berlin is called the Museum Island, or, when referring to the southern part, Fisherman's Island. Both parts together more or less correspond to former Köln. The Berlin Dome is a cathedral that dates from the beginning of this century. Its inauguration was in 1905, and ever since, people have made fun of its style, a combination of Baroque and Neo-Renaissance. But nevertheless, it belongs to the cityscape. Certainly more than the Palace of the Republic, a soulless box of marble and glass from the 1970s. Under this building, and the large parking space in front of it, there are still the remains of the Berlin City Palace, the greatest work of Andreas Schlüter and his successor, Eotzander von Gotha. The palace once praised as the major work of Northern German Baroque. In the last years of the war, it had been severely damaged, and it was knocked down in 1950, probably because some people believe that by removing the building, they could also eradicate the spirit of the past. One detail is enough to show the artistic elegance of the vanished palace. The Eotzander portal that was incorporated into the facade of the GDR State Council building. It was not pulled down because it was from the balcony of this building that Karl Liebknecht proclaimed the Socialist Republic in 1918. Arbitrary measures and chance make poor city architects. The Marstall has remained, the stables for the royal horses and coaches built for Wilhelm II in 1900. And in the direction of Breitestrasse, there are a few houses that have seen better days. Islands depend on their links to the mainland. The city has 600 bridges, more than Venice, legendary for its number of bridges. But for centuries, the Mühlendamm Bridge was the only crossing over the River Spree in Berlin. At Friedrichsgracht, a jewel from the 18th century has been preserved, the Jungfernbrücke, a drawbridge based on a Dutch model whose technical construction has remained unchanged to the present day. It is only here at Inselbrücke, or Island Bridge, that the view over to the mainland is now perhaps more beautiful than it used to be. At Märkisches Ufer, the old town houses have been restored, and a few additional ones that used to stand in other streets have been added. The most famous is probably the house of the tobacco merchant Wilhelm Ermiller, that now houses several restaurants. The main crossing over the river Spree, however, continues to be the Schlossbrücke, constructed according to the designs of Carl Friedrich Schinkel. This is where the Royal Mile began, leading from Unter den Linden to Brandenburg Gate and on to the Tiergarten. The equestrian statue on Unter den Linden is probably the greatest and most popular work of Christian Daniel Rauch, Frederick the Great. He was the man who made Unter den Linden the showpiece avenue of Berlin and made Prussia a major European power. The Communist Party in East Germany had a hard time coming to terms with the great king. If the people of the state of the GDR were to forget their Prussian traditions, the Hohenzollern monarch had to disappear. So he was banished to Sanssouci until he was suddenly reinstated in the hope that some of Prussia's old glory would rub off on the tattered reality of real socialism. That is why, since 1980, he has been back at what almost corresponds to his old place, at the edge of the Forum Fridericianum, his residence and part of an impressive complex. There is only one notable building that already existed before the time of Frederick the Great, the Zeughaus, the armory of the Prussian army. After the removal of the city palace, it is definitely the most significant Baroque building in Berlin. It was the work of several architects, but Andreas Schlüter set a lasting memorial with his sculptures. The masks of the dying warriors are moving evidence of how stone can live and die. Then there used to be an aristocrat's palace from the 17th century that the soldier king had reconstructed for his son. Everything else was added by Frederick, according to a grand plan that was to make his residence comparable to ancient Rome, a forum of intellect and of the arts. After having the Prinzessinnen Palace built, he ordered the construction of the Opera House, which is the present-day State Opera. The Hedwigskirche was also erected according to Frederick's ideas. To provoke his rival, Maria Theresia, he had the library built as a copy of the Viennese Hofburg. It didn't take the Berliners long to find a nickname for it, the chest of drawers. The northern border of the Forum consists of a palace commissioned by the king for his brother Heinrich. Later, Wilhelm von Humboldt was able to persuade King Friedrich Wilhelm to donate the building for a university. The first students came here in 1810. Alexander and Wilhelm von Humboldt, the one a natural scientist, the other a man of letters, both have their place of honor in front of the Humboldt University. After the Wars of Liberation, Karl Friedrich Schinkel added the Neue Wache to the Forum. In 1931, it was converted into a memorial for the soldiers who had died in the war. Today, it is dedicated to the victims of war and suppression. Frederick the Great had a considerable influence on the appearance of Berlin. It was Friedrichstadt in particular which he raised to world rank, on a par with other great royal residences in Europe. At the time of his accession to the throne, there were still horse stables of the gendarmes, a light cavalry regiment, in a square around the French and the German church. Frederick had the stables torn down, and in their place, a French comedy house was erected. Since then, the square has been called Gendarmenmarkt, and instead of the comedy house, which burned down in 1817, we now have the Schauspielhaus, the most beautiful concert hall in the capital. Frederick had cupolas put on the towers, mirror images of each other. They symbolize the cultural debt that Brandenburg owes to the Huguenots, who had been expelled from France. the urban showpiece that Karl Friedrich Schinkel and Karl von Gotthard had built. By the end of the war, there was nothing left but a pile of rubble. The architects who rebuilt the square tried to recreate some of its former appeal. The new Dome Hotel owes a great deal of its charm to its unique surroundings. When the Berliners hear Friedrichstadt, they immediately think of Friedrichstadt Palast and Friedrichstrasse, and they're not that far off the mark. This 2-mile-long street, which forms a straight line from north to south, is part of it. At its northern end, not far from Oranienburg Gate, the Star of David shines once again over the synagogue in a district that used to be the center of Jewish life in Berlin. The Friedrichstrasse, a many-faceted street full of contrasts. The Friedrichstadt Palast is the largest variety show theater in Berlin, a place that meets the highest international standards. The theater am Schiffbaudamm gained world fame under Bertolt Brecht and Helene Weigel as the Berliner Ensemble. The railway station, Friedrichstrasse. For countless people, this was the heavily guarded gate to West Berlin, to the free world. The Kranzler Corner Unter den Linden doesn't exist anymore. Nowadays, it is the Grand Hotel that flanks the southern part of Friedrichstrasse. For 30 years in the lives of East Berliners, Friedrichstrasse and the world stopped at Leipziger Strasse. The world-famous Checkpoint Charlie was located at this point, where the Soviet and American sectors touched. It was here that after the construction of the wall in August 1961, American and Soviet tanks faced each other, eyeball to eyeball. This was the beginning of a tragic chapter in the history of the city, a time when people risked their lives for human rights. The Wall Museum at Checkpoint Charlie. Ours are fast-paced times. Very soon, it will be difficult to find any traces of those years. The Brandenburg Gate in Germany's most difficult times, the spring of 1945. The collapse of Hitler's Germany, the division of the city. This gate represented separation or transit, but it always stood for the entire city. A landmark that is also an expression of historical process. In the decades of the wall, a visit to the Brandenburg Gate was on the agenda of prominent politicians from both sides, and failing to pay such a visit was also considered a political statement.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
The gate is open. The wall has been torn down. To return the landmark to its old glory, its crown, the quadriga, also had to be thoroughly restored. The steel scaffolding had become corroded, and the tumultuous celebrations of joy on New Year's Eve, 1989 and 1990 took their toll. This was not the first time that the bronze horse-drawn chariot was removed. In 1808, Napoleon carried it off to Paris as war booty. In 1814, the Prussians carried it back. The quadriga was completely destroyed in the Second World War and had to be reconstructed afterwards. At that time, the authorities in the East had the eagle and iron cross on Irani's staff removed in order to eliminate the spirit of Prussian militarism. In 1991, 200 years after its inauguration, the gate is complete again. Even works of art do not remain untouched by politics. The Reichstag, built 100 years ago, an imposing building, 132 yards long, 88 yards wide, and 27 yards high, not counting the mighty dome. The dome had to be blown off in 1957 and has not been reconstructed since. Today, after more than half a century, it will once again be the seat of a democratically elected German parliament. History merging into the present. The Reichstag fire of 1933, the Soviet flag on the ruins in 1945. But it is here that history was just recently a cruel presence. The Spree River separated two different worlds. Few other borders in Europe were so heavily guarded. Even when there were rock concerts at the Reichstag, large parts of the adjacent East German area were cordoned off by the police. Past and present, the 3rd of October, 1990.
In Feiertagsstimmung wollen wir die Einheit und Freiheit Deutschlands vollenden. Für unsere Aufgaben sind wir uns der Verantwortung vor Gott und den Menschen bewusst. Wir wollen in einem vereinten Europa dem Frieden der Welt dienen.
The Tiergarten, once the hunting grounds of the great elector, is also full of historical memories. The Soviet Memorial. And yet, in spite of all the history it evokes, Berlin is by no means a museum. Berlin is very much alive and ever-changing, and Berlin is a city with parks and trees. When you arrive by plane, you see a scenery of woods, trees, and lakes. There are green areas all over Berlin. It is a city with tree-lined streets that has always managed to defend its parks against any appropriation attempts by real estate. And it's a city that has tried to retain some of that once famous Berlin air, so that in the future it will be able to provide at least a little respite from the hectic pace of a big city. The beauty of the Tiergarten. Frederick the Great had his architect, Knobelsdorff, transform it into a park that was open to the public. It was this beauty that made Frederick's youngest brother, August Ferdinand, decide to have a castle built here, Schloss Bellevue. After being destroyed in the Second World War, it was rebuilt as the official Berlin residence of the President of the Federal Republic. From here, it's only a short walk to the Siegessäule at Grosser Stern. It had originally been set up to mark the victory over Denmark in 1864, but by the time the monument had been completed, Austria and France had been vanquished as well. For contemporaries, these really were perceived as victorious battles on the way from Prussia to Germany. They seem to be glorious battles, and if you take a closer look at the victory column, it turns out to be an astonishing monument whose platform affords a wonderful view of the whole city. All the streets going off Grosser Stern, the green parks, the residential buildings and business areas, and the vast arid expanse that was once Leipziger Platz and Potsdamer Platz. Potsdamer Platz, a time for memories. This was the city in its most concentrated form. Berlin, people say, may not have invented traffic, but it was certainly here that it first began to cause problems. And it was here that the first solutions were developed. Red, green, and yellow. Traffic lights were invented in Berlin and tried out at Potsdamer Platz. The Potsdamer Platz was a center for all kinds of traffic until it was destroyed in the war. This was followed by a short, but in a way, significant time when it became the three-country corner between the British, American, and Soviet sectors, and provided untold opportunities for the black market, as well as safe escape routes. Something which was only possible in Berlin. But one day, this also came to an end. Even here, or maybe especially here. The underground closed down. The streets were barricaded. The Anhalter Bahnhof, which had been the most representative of all the railway stations, was now out of service. And all this in a city that was becoming increasingly cut off from its surroundings. It was 1961. Already once before, in 1948 and 49, times were tough in Berlin. The Berlin blockade lasted 11 months, and it was only thanks to the Allied airlift and the perseverance and courage of the Berliners that it could be overcome. More than 270,000 flights carrying almost 2 million tons of supplies. There were times when the intervals between landings was only 60 seconds. At that time, it was in Tempelhof that the fate of Berlin was decided. Remembering the victims and moments of solidarity. The Berliners downplay history and call this monument to those times of courage and solidarity the Hunger Rake. 1948, the political division of Berlin. In March, the Soviet Union left the Allied Control Council. In September, the city parliament, with the exception of its communist members, moved its sessions to West Berlin. The town hall of the district Schöneberg then became the seat of the government. In 1950, the Freedom Bell, the President of the American people, rang out for the first time, and in 1963, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the President of the United States, spoke to 500,000 Berliners.
All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin, and therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
West Berlin was the outpost of the free world. A surrealistic cage, someone once said. The ones who are inside are free. And that made Berlin a factor in world politics, not only in political terms, but also morally and economically. The Berlin district of Kreuzberg has filled old structures with new contents. Already, Kreuzberg is one of the most sought-after downtown areas. This is Berlin at its most lively, most original, and yet very much international. A bit of Montmartre, a bit of Soho, a dash of Istanbul. No matter whether you are Turkish, Greek, or German, when you live here, you very soon become a member of the Kreuzberg community. And this is the hill that gave this open-minded district its name. The Kreuzberg, with its romantic waterfall that is turned on in spring and turned off again in fall. On top of the Kreuzberg is the National Memorial by Schinkel. It was erected as a reminder of the glorious battles of the Liberation Wars. Victoria Park. Impressions of Kreuzberg, a part of Berlin with its own special appeal. Speaking of old structures, the railway needs 11 bridges to cross Yorkstrasse in Kreuzberg. And new projects for inner-city traffic are already being considered. At Gleisdreieck, where once the underground trains, the S-Bahn, and the railway trains had moved on 3 different levels, traffic is still restrained, up to now. Many of the railway lines were simply capped in the years in which the city was divided. Here the underground will link Gleisdreieck in the west with Stadtmitte in the east. Berlin can no longer afford the detours that have had resulted from these former hard-pressed times. Here, the city has a unique opportunity, an area in which bold ideas are taking shape, but that still leaves scope for new developments. This is the new Philharmonic Hall, the Kulturforum, and not far away, the large and barren area around Potsdamer Platz, soon to be the central square of Germany's capital again. Designs are being discussed. Here, innovative designs must be combined with responsible urban planning. Responsibility for the future. Between planning and reconstruction, an attempt to present the phenomenon of the Berlin Wall at its historical site in a new way. Roger Waters, The Wall, July 21st, 1990. The wall has come down. Berlin is one city again, a time for new beginnings. At Charlottenburg Gate, the Elector Friedrich III of Brandenburg and his wife, Sophie Charlotte. She is holding the castle that the Elector had built for her near the little village of Litzow. What Johann Arnold Neering and Eosander von Gotha had carried out on the commission of the Elector was called Charlottenburg, and gave the adjacent settlement its present name, making Charlottenburg the second town of residence. The famous equestrian statue of the great Elector by Andreas Schlüter used to be at Langebrücke. It has now found its place here, a location that is appropriate in several respects. The Charlottenburg Castle was by no means less devastated by war than the city palace, but after this first castle had been blasted away, it became a point of honor for the Berliners to save the second Hohenzollern castle. The mausoleum for Queen Louisa. Louisa died in 1810 at the age of 34, a young woman, beloved by her people, beloved even today. The little village, Litzow, has become a kind of second city center, a center of the arts and sciences, a cultural center with museums, universities, and theaters. Cabaret, a successful musical production at Theater des Westens. The Schiller Theater. The Deutsche Opera House had originally been founded as the bourgeois counterpart to the Royal Linden Opera House, but then came into its own as a stage of world rank. A performance of the Richard Strauss opera, Arabella. Charlottenburg also means the Zoo Railway Station and the Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church, the Europa Center, and the Kurfürstendamm. Here, Berlin is a world city. A little bit of Broadway, a little bit of the Champs-Élysées. Similarities, contrasts. Contrasts that make life interesting. Beginning long before you reach the Zoo Railway Station, and ending somewhere in the west where the Kurfürstendamm starts to become boring. But that's still a long way off. It's always rush hour at Kurfürstendamm. At Funkturm, it begins in the afternoon, and in no time, there's real congestion. Officially, it's called the Freeway Junction Funkturm, but Berliners really call it a traffic knot. Here, at the foot of the already 65-year-old Funkturm, is an international center for fairs and congresses. The Funkturm, well, it's been a long time since it broadcast the voice of the capital. Now it's merely used for taxi and police radio transmission. And it's used by the Berliners. But if someone doesn't reach the western part of Berlin before evening, it's no problem at all. On the contrary, this is where nights become interesting, and the appeal of Kurfürstendamm may have a lot to do with its nightlife. The Berliner in the Tower Cafe takes his guests to the window and tells them, "Come and look, that's Berlin."